Hello, it's Alden. Here are 17 green screen tips in 6 minutes to help you get a cinema quality key. These are all tips and tricks I use as I've been working on my sci-fi film, The Robosexual. Keying in After Effects can be pretty intense on your computer. I have a ton of RAM on my PC build, and real-time playback is still pretty much impossible when these effects are used. So expect a lot of rendering shots out to watch playback, especially if you're working in 4K like I am. One of the best ways you can get started is to first denoise your footage. This is gonna help with all of the kind of chattering that goes on later in the process. You can use a paid plugin like Neat Video, which works super well, but there's also built-in denoisers in After Effects as well. When you're doing a key, you don't have to key out the entire green screen in the background, only the green edges around your actor. So you can make a garbage matte with your footage so you're only looking at that specific green. Always use multiple keys. My go-to are all of these effects in this order. I use Lumetri to increase the saturation of green on the footage. Use Keylight normally, adjust your screen matte, but always set it to intermediate result. Apply a curves effect, set it to alpha, and then pull back the alpha a little bit down on the bottom. Use Key Cleaner, turn on reduce chatter and use these settings. Advanced spill suppressor set to ultra. Sometimes leaving it green like this works. Other times I will go in, select the actual green color. After Effects does the operations of these effects in order. So make sure you have Lumetri turned on when you're selecting that color. Then I use Refine Matte with these settings here. That's gonna give you a pretty good smooth edge on all of your footage, but it's not gonna be great for hair. So always use multiple keys. One for the body, one for the hair, one for anything moving quickly that has a lot of motion blur. Sometimes with these effects, you're gonna get this weird kind of blurring along the edges, and that's from your mask. So instead of using masks for each of your different keys, use a matte instead and set it to alpha. This stack of effects can be pretty intense, so here I recommend rendering out a luma or an alpha matte of your key. If you're doing alpha, you can just do a PNG sequence, making sure you have alpha selected. Or if you want a luma matte, add a fill with white and put a black solid behind it. Now use this matte with your original footage. Be sure to add spill suppressor again. Another thing you might want to do is add back some hair detail. One way you can do that is taking your footage, tinting it, and adjusting all of the luma values and setting it to multiply behind your key. Another way to add hair detail back is to use After Effects' rotobrush tool. When you add back all of the fine detail of the hair, you'll usually end up with this gray haze around the edge of your key. It's especially noticeable in front of a black or dark background. Sometimes you can just use the luma correction and the advanced spill suppressor, and that'll take care of it. Sometimes if you go into Lumetri, Curves, Hue, and Luma, select the green and bring the darkness down. Put this before advanced spill suppressor. Another way you can get rid of that is to take a dark layer, set it to your matte, mask out just the edges, feather it, and adjust the opacity to your liking. The amount of detail you need on your hair or the gray edges all depends on what is actually behind the actor. If you have a really bright background and your actor is backlit, those white edges don't matter at all. But if the background is dark, that's when you're definitely gonna see it. If you have a close-up, sometimes you're gonna wanna rotoscope back some details of the face. Yep, even with keying, there is a lot of rotoscoping. I like to use Mocha. It's great at tracking the face and get a nice smooth matte. If you get all these white edges from motion blur, apply the pixel motion blur effect. Turn up the steps. This is very render intensive, so this might be another part of the process where you render out your shot. Here's a tip if you are using a 3D environment. You can make a simple recreation of the room and the lighting so you can see how shadows are gonna react. For example, when I did that with this green screen shot, I could see that the camera's facing side of the table should have been completely silhouetted, but our production footage didn't show that. And that's why it kind of just looked wrong against the background. So I was able to mask it out to add more silhouette. Your color matching is super important. A lot of the time you'll be looking at a key and it just looks wrong. And you might think it's all your key settings, but really it's the color of the foreground and the background. To get a good match, you wanna look at the highlights and shadow and match their value and color. Here you just wanna get them to match, and then you can add an adjustment layer to your entire scene where you can add a grade to give it more style. If you're bringing keyed footage into Blender, make sure you also render out the subjects and backgrounds separately so you can control for some of this later in your composite. I find I have much more color control in After Effects than I do in Blender, and this helps a lot. If you render out a mispass, you can also use that as a luma matte. Once I have my shot good to go, I like to add a little blur to the edges because actual footage isn't gonna be as clean as this key is. I take an adjustment layer, add a very subtle camera lens blur effect, and just roughly mask out the edges and give it a good feather. If you have anything really bright in the background, adding a light wrap is really gonna help blend your shot. You can do this a couple ways. One is with a glow adjustment layer, but sometimes that's hard to control. Instead, what you can do is take an instance of the background and add these effects to it. Fast blur, set matte, channel blur set to alpha, and then duplicate the set matte and click invert. If you set this layer to screen or add, a blurred layer of your background is gonna slowly fold over your keyed footage. Be careful because this is really fun to do and it's easy to overdo it, especially if you're making a Star Wars prequel. If you use an image for your background, use match grain, set it to your footage, and adjust as needed. And this is really gonna make the shot come to life, because even with the denoiser, there's always some noise and grain in your footage. You can also add a grain overlay set to a low opacity to your background. Knowing all these tips and tricks has helped me because even if I use the same lights on the same green screen, every shot is different. There's different quirks and nuances to every key that I do, but all of these techniques help me make sure I get a good key. Let me know in the comments below if you have other tips and tricks that have helped you when you've been working with green screen footage.